Gallaudet University presents.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to turn off my voice and let the interpreters do their job. Your hands. Oh. I'm sorry.
Good afternoon. Today we have with us Dr. Thangi Appanah, who is a faculty member in the Department of Education here at Gallaudet. We are looking forward to her presentation, largely because most of the presentations that we have had as a part of our VL2 lecture series have involved cognitive psychologists and neurobiological researchers, but what we have not yet seen is someone who has done classroom research. And classroom research is extremely difficult to do. We also have someone with us who has 22 years of experience in the classroom, including 9 years teaching language arts with deaf students, and 3.5 years as principal of an elementary school for deaf children. So because of that background, it is always a pleasure to listen to research that has been done by people who have such a great deal of experience in the classroom. Because what we essentially are trying to do at VL2 is make discoveries that will lead to the improvement of education for children who are deaf and hard of hearing. But we don't often hear about research that's happening in the classroom, which is a problem and something that is seriously missing from a good deal of the work in the field. But we are changing that to some degree today because we will be listening to a talk about a classroom research project on a topic that's very important, which is how to improve the writing abilities of deaf children, what strategies might be used to teach deaf and hard of hearing children about how to write better, which has been an issue for many years that has puzzled educators of deaf students, and it's something that we have grappled with for many years. With that, I look forward to hearing about strategies that may work, that may contribute to the field of improving instruction for deaf and hard of hearing children in the area of writing. Thangi? Thank you, Tom. Before I begin my talk, I wanted to start by saying thank you to all of you who have come out today. I appreciate your attendance. And hopefully at the end of the talk, I'll get some feedback from the professionals in the room today who are involved in doing research, who maybe can do future research. I think that mine is more like field work, and what you do is more research. I also wanted to say that during my presentation, I have asked the interpreters to sign for me. And the reason for that is that my academic language abilities in ASL, I do not think are sufficient to allow for a very clear presentation of the information that I intend to share with you today. So for that reason, and because I want to make sure that everybody gets a clear sense of what I'm saying, I'm now going to turn it over to the interpreters.
Good afternoon. So I think you've had enough advertisement of my topic, so I don't have to say that again. The conceptual framework for my study was based on the social constructionist theory and the theories underlining the product and process approach in writing. As you all are already familiar with this, the social constructionist theory grows mainly from the work of Vygotsky and his theory states that learning results from interactions with others. It could be an adult or it could be a peer. And also, this learning occurs within a zone of proximal development. So the zone of proximal development refers to learning that takes place in a child. Previously, the child was not able to do a task on his or her own, but now with the help or with interacting with an adult or a peer, the child is able to do that task independently. So looking at the process of writing, we can see that writing is a social activity that occurs from interactions with adults, with an adult, or with the peers in the classroom, and also scaffolding these writing activities so that the child would come to a better understanding of how to write. I know some of us in the room are familiar with the product approach that occurred prior to the 1970s. This was an approach that used a bottom-up approach to writing. So the teachers assigned a topic, the students took that topic, wrote about it, and the teacher collected their work and corrected it and gave it back to the students. There was no interaction with the work. Students could not talk about the work. They did the work for the teacher, and that was the end of it. So the product writing focuses on the end product. The process approach is an approach that started in the 1980s, and it came about mainly because of whole language. This approach was concerned about what students did during the writing process. There was no emphasis on the end product. They just focused on the process, and the researchers stated that learning happened while the students were in the process of writing. So the process approach looked at writing as a whole. So now they did not look at the basis of a sentence. They looked at the writing as a whole. And many researchers proposed that if the teacher focused on the process, the product took care of itself. And at the same time, there was a lot of learning happening, and there was an internalization process that took place for the students regarding his or her writing. So how do we create a process in a classroom? You can have writing conferences, and these writing conferences can be peer conferences or teacher conferences. During this process, students are empowered to make changes to their own writing. The role of the student changes from being a passive learner and becoming an active learner. Now, having looked at those two theories, what will benefit deaf students in the classroom? Deaf students need to be shown the structure that English and ASL are two different languages, and they have their own structure. So obviously, they do need the product approach. On the other hand, deaf students also need to know how to generate ideas. And this can come about by using the process approach. So researchers that work with deaf children are saying that we need a balanced approach. With the way whole language is being used, the teachers are using the process approach, but they're not emphasizing editing with the students, they're not emphasizing the structure. And if the teacher does the writing process correctly within the process approach, the teacher can use many lessons to address the product and to address the actual structure in languages. There was research that was done with the process approach in deaf students, and generally these researchers found that deaf students actually improved their writing using the process approach. One study by Cluwin and Kelly found what they did was they had 52 teachers from all over the nation trained on how to use the process approach, and they had these teachers go back to, these teachers came from 10 school districts. They went back to their schools and applied the process approach to 144 students. And overall, they found that the writing of these students had improved, and not only just their writing, but the quality of writing had improved. This study investigated the impact of the DSER, which is a deaf student editing rubric that I had developed by finding out from teachers of the deaf what characteristics of student writing gave them the most trouble or they struggled with. And based on that, I developed this rubric. There was no document reader in this room, so I'm unable to show you the rubric, but I do have a copy if you are interested, or later on you could always email me and I could send you a copy to look at. So this rubric looked at deaf students as visual learners, and it also looked at using this rubric as a scaffold to improve their writing, and this takes us back to Vygotsky's theory. The rubric itself helps students to edit or revise their writing on their own. The design of the study, I used a mixed method study. I also used a quasi-experimental pre-post design. The reason I used the quasi-experimental pre-post design was because deaf students who have ASL as the first language in the population that I looked at, it was a very small number, and I could not find another number of students to be able to have a control group. So for the dependent variable, I looked at students' writing performance. I looked at their completed writing samples and the rubrics that they used. I looked at how many, did they make marks on their rubrics? How often did they change their writing? I also looked at their pre-post writing scores. As the independent variable, I looked at the students' use of the rubric. Some of this information I got from the interviews with the students. Some information I got from interviews with the teachers. I also gave a numerical value to the degree of use. So if a student just attached a rubric to his or her assignment, they got a 0. However, if they attached their rubric to their assignment, but their writing showed some kind of change, they got 1 point. The most points of 5 were awarded when students had marks on their rubrics and they changed their writing 3 or more times. So that helped me analyze my study and see the effect of the rubric. There were 2 levels of participation. Level 1, I had 15 students that were deaf. ASL was their first language, and these students were junior high school students and senior high school students. So I had students all the way from 7th grade through 12th grade. The level 2 students were 8 students from the original 15 that I interviewed 3 times that year. I interviewed them in November, in April, and in June. During the interview, they were asked questions on how they perceived the rubric. Did they see it as something valuable to changing their writing? And how did they perceive their writing? Did they see a change in their writing? I analyzed the interview data by using the grounded theory approach. To ensure validity of the data, I had triangulation. I looked at the data from the student interviews and the student written work, which was their completed writing assignments and their rubrics. And I also took the data from my interviews with the teachers, whom I interviewed after each interview with the student, and I also met with them at the beginning of the year and the end of the year. So I took their perception of how they felt the students were using the rubrics. They verified if the students were using it or not using it. They verified if the students were really making a change in their writing. My data sources for my level 1 participants and level 2 participants were the completed writing assignments and rubrics, pre-post writing scores, and teacher feedback on the student use of the rubric. My level 2 participants, in addition to the above data sources, I also interviewed them 3 times a year in November, February, and June. So how did I obtain my results? I collected the writing samples and had them blind scored by 3 raters. Before I did that, I had to get inter-rater reliability, which was very hard to get, seeing that there were different individuals and teachers were rating them not objectively but subjectively. But eventually, I had to do it over and over again until I got that inter-rater reliability. I didn't get it in all areas. For example, ideas, and I could not get a common response from all the teachers, just because one teacher looked at the student writing, and if they looked at it and they understood the ASL, they said that the writing they gave it a higher score. Whereas another teacher was concerned about the English, and she gave it a lower score. So for the study, I actually left out ideas, and I focused only on 3 aspects, which was word choice, sentence fluency, and convention. I took the baseline samples from the spring of the previous year and the fall of that year, and I found the median between those 2, the average of those 2 scores. Then I took the post-writing samples from April and May, and I got the average of those 2 scores. So these 2 averages made up my pre and post score. They were scored on a 5-point scale using a modified version of the 6-tray analytical rubric. So as I mentioned before, I did focus on 3 aspects, which was word choice, sentence fluency, and conventions. I found that all the students increased their writing scores, despite whether they were interviewed or not. However, the interviewed students, 6 out of 8 students increased their scores by 3 or more on this 5-point scale. And the 2 students that did not increase their scores, when talking to the teacher, 1 student already had a high score for his pre-test. So he had 3. So he didn't increase it by 2 to get 5. The non-interviewed students, on the other hand, 3 out of 7 increased it by 3 or more. There were more students, 4 out of 7, that increased it by 2 or less. So overall, we can see our interview group performed better. When I analyzed my interview data, I found that there were a number of emergent categories that came up. And what I did was I used open coding to analyze these categories. So I would look at the students' responses, and I noticed patterns that developed, and I would note these patterns on index cards. Thereafter, I organized these index cards into categories, into wider categories. And I used an innovation configuration map to organize these categories. And these are the emergent categories that came up. Students talked about the potential impact of the rubric, whether they thought it helped them or did not help them. The one thing that excited me most about the research was that metacognitive processes took place. The language that the students were using in the first interview was very surface language, very technical language, and that started to change by the last interview. Their language became more sophisticated. They were using more technical terms. They were using aspects from the rubric to actually describe their writing. And so this shows that they were actually thinking about their writing, and there was an interaction between the students and their writing itself. They viewed themselves as independent writers. Most of the students that I interviewed viewed themselves as an independent writer. There were a few students that still felt that it was a teacher's job to change their writing. And they felt they still needed the teacher, they didn't feel that confident. Students also attached a negative or a positive value to this rubric. They looked at this rubric as something that's going to really help me, or I really don't like using it, it's too tedious, it's too hard to use. And students also informed me whether they would or will not continue use of the rubric. Majority of the students that were interviewed said they will continue use of the rubric. And another category that emerged was that students started talking about the actual changes in their writing. While they were being interviewed, they mentioned, I changed in the words that I started to use. I changed in sequencing of my writing, or the way I was using transitional words. So as we can see, the largest change occurred with the interviewed group. So this shows that maybe the discussion with an adult helped. The fact that I interviewed the students, asking them questions about rubric use and their writing, helped them to internalize this writing process, helped them to internalize and skills that they could use to change and self-edit their writing. I found that students that were using their writing, their rubric more often and consistently, made more changes in their writing and improved their writing score as well. Those students that were low users did not make much changes in their writing. And the low users mainly came from the non-interviewed group. I also found that students needed to be motivated. And this could be linked to the fact that the teachers were using the rubrics differently. This was one aspect of the study that I did not see up front, but I found that the 4 teachers that I had in my study were all using the rubric differently. The first teacher, she gave the students the rubrics and she mandated their use. The second teacher placed it in a very visible spot in the classroom and encouraged the students to use it every time it was writing time. The third teacher was a junior high school teacher. She said, my students are not really ready to look at all aspects of the rubric. It's too hard for them. I will have them look at selected areas. So she had them use the rubric, but not for every area. The fourth teacher actually limited the use of the rubric. She used the rubric for specific assigned papers that she gave the students. At other times, she gave the students other rubrics, or she did use other strategies in the classroom. So as we can see, whether the teacher mandated it or not, motivated the students or demotivated them not to use it. And so those students that were in the teacher's class who limited the use of the rubrics, they were not consistent users. And obviously their writing didn't change as much. Now let's see what our students were telling me in the interview about the rubric. When I interviewed the students, some of the students commented it was a pain in the neck. They were like, I not only have to do the writing for my teacher, now I have to use the yellow paper you give me. I made it all yellow, so the students were referring to the rubric as a yellow paper. I prefer the teacher editing the work for me. It's much easier. Then in June, the same student was saying, the rubric helped me self-edit. And the rubric made me think about my writing. So this brings us to the metacognition process that took place. So there were many implications of this study. The rubric could be used as a scaffold in the writing classroom. It actually enabled the students to get involved in the writing process without having a teacher to control the students and tell them what to do. They automatically picked up the writing rubric and they went to their writing and they made the changes. It was obviously ineffective when used in isolation. That group that was not interviewed did not make that much changes to their writing and did not score that high in their writing prompts. Teacher beliefs affected rubric implementation, and we saw that clearly. The rubric also served as a checklist. The student was able to take the rubric, and this information I got from actually interviewing the students. The students said they were able to take the rubric, and the rubric gave them expectations of what to put into their writing. So not only did they look at the rubric after they wrote, but the next time they were writing a piece, they used the rubric to guide what was expected of them. So they used it as a checklist while writing as well. There were some themes that emerged at the end of my study that I was not aware will happen at the beginning of the study. It was metacognition, which we talked about at length earlier. The role of self-assessment in improving student writing. The fact that the students were taking the rubric and evaluating their writing using the categories from the rubric helped them self-assess their own writing and also helped improve their performance. The role of the rubric in producing self-regulated writers. Previously, teachers would have to facilitate the whole writing process, but here students were becoming self-regulated writers. They were developing ownership in their writing. They were developing accountability. Suddenly, the writing became serious to them, and they found that they were performing better just by using this rubric. And it made them more confident as writers. And this confidence went back to actually improve their writing. Obviously, there was a shift from teacher dependence to teacher independence, to independence and using it by themselves. Previously, they would depend on the teacher and even tell me at my first interview that it's the teacher's job to edit my writing. I'm not doing that. Why are you forcing me to do that? But eventually, they were becoming independent writers, and they were liking it. They did not see that many, when the teacher eventually got their papers to grade, they did not see that many teacher edits, and that made them really happy and actually increased their confidence in their writing. And overall, the rubric helped them develop a positive writing attitude, which is very difficult even to get among hearing students. From this study, some ideas for future research emerges, and this study could be conducted again, but this time over a longer period of time, maybe looking at students writing from the 7th grade through the 9th grade, or looking at it from the 10th grade through the 12th grade. The study can also be completed by using a control group from another deaf school. However, we all know that that is really difficult to do in a classroom or in the educational field in general. The one thing I did not do was conduct a baseline interview where I interviewed the students before rubric use. And maybe in another study that could be done to see the actual contrast from before using the rubric to after using the rubric. The rubric can also be used over different age groups. I can see this rubric being used with elementary students. There isn't much research on self-assessment and self-regulation in deaf students. And a few weeks ago, I looked for research again, and there still wasn't much. There also isn't much research for writing in adolescent deaf students. There's a lot of research on writing in elementary level deaf students, but not a lot in this age group. So maybe there could be more research based on actually looking at self-assessment and self-regulation. Also, research on metacognition and writing. there is some research on metacognition and math and reading, but nothing on writing. For the questions, I would take the questions by signing to you.
Before anyone does ask a question, I would like to remind the audience that we'd ask you to come to the front to ask your questions. You'll also see on the stage 2 red pieces of tape, which are markers of where you should put your left and right foot so that you can stand in such a way that the remote audience can see you, because the camera will be able to capture you, and Thangi will be able to see you, and the audience will be able to see you. People often come up and face the presenter directly, and then people seated to the left of the auditorium can't see you, so these red pieces of tape were placed very strategically so that everyone in our audience, both live and remote, can see you. If you are going to ask your question in English, there is a microphone right here. Okay, so we have very clear rules for the question and answer session. Do you have an example of what the rubric looks like? I do. I have a copy of the rubric here. I wanted to show it, but there isn't a document reader that would have allowed me to show the rubric, so I couldn't show it. Okay. Also, what about deaf students who are in mainstreamed educational settings? Do you think that the rubric could apply in those cases? Or how would you overcome that problem of if the school already used its own rubric? The rubric is most applicable to those who use ASL. If deaf and hard of hearing students are already writing in English word order, then this particular rubric may not be all that applicable because the rubric is written for ASL users. Not necessarily only ASL users, but I mean deaf and hard of hearing students who may use signed exact English and still struggle with their writing. Do you think that your rubric would be useful for students who grow up with that sort of educational approach? When you see the rubric, you'll see that the word order of the items in the cells of the rubric are written in the word order of ASL. So, and then there will be a sample of what the sentence would look like in English. So I don't know that it would be all that useful for students who don't use ASL. The point of this study really, though, shows that the rubric itself doesn't matter so much. It's more so that students are using something as a tool to scaffold them, which then leads to improvements in their writing. You guys should have put the tape down in the shape of a footprint. Thank you for your presentation. It was very informative. I am interested in seeing the rubric, but I'm also interested in how the students came to understand rules of grammatical structure, how they knew when to use different verb tenses or verb structures. How does your study address that? So essentially, are you talking about overall writing structures, or are you talking about grammatical structures? The rubric is broken down into categories, and there's an example of a sentence in English for each category. So, for example, one category has to do with subject-verb agreement. And the item in the rubric says subject-verb agreement have. There's a sample of a sentence in English where the subject and the verb are underlined so you can see how they agree. So this rubric helps them to understand grammatical structures better. Well, so for example, how would a student know rules about how to use prepositions or definite articles? Because there are a number of rules and then, of course, exceptions to rules. So how does your rubric help guide students in making these decisions? Well, to go back to the subject-verb agreement example, they can see the item on the rubric, and then if they're using a preposition, it is common that deaf students underuse prepositions or entirely omit them because of the nature of the structure of ASL. So, for example, students will often confuse the term sleepover and oversleep. And then they'll also confuse those two instances with the word over. So we give examples on the rubric. And additionally, this is a tool that students are using in the writing process. So if a teacher sees that a student is having a particular problem with prepositions, the teacher might have a mini lesson on prepositions, and maybe we'll talk to the students about how they describe location of different things, and then look at how we say things in English, which would of course require the use of prepositions. So teachers could do these mini lessons as needed until they see improvement in the students' writing. What sorts of visual aids were used? It depended on the classroom. ASL was the language of instruction, and teachers often connected what they wrote in English on the board with what they were saying in ASL. Another tool was to have students sign a story in ASL and then have someone who watched that story write it in English. Often in these mini lessons, you don't talk about all the rules of English at once. You will address one rule in, say, a 10-minute lesson, do activities that focus on that one part of the grammar, and then see how students apply that to their writing. As was mentioned, I taught language arts, and in teaching language arts, I often focused on one part of the grammar at a time to heighten students' awareness of it, and then they would start noticing it more. What grade level did you teach at? I taught at the high school level. What about early elementary grades and middle elementary grades? If you have this tool, could it be used for early elementary grades? I think it could be. I was the principal of an elementary school too, and I had the teachers that worked with me select which items they wanted on the rubric, and as I developed the rubric, I got feedback from them, and that wasn't a part of the study, but that was something that I wanted them to use, that they could use in their daily classroom use. Any other questions? Going once, going twice, gone. Well, thank you very much, Thangi, for a very captivating presentation. I'm interested in talking to you more about the research design, and hopefully you'll continue with this research. It is very important work. Thank you so much for coming and presenting as part of our VL2 lecture series. Well, thank you for having me.
This has been a production of Gallaudet University.